Visage is a psychological horror game inspired by the ever-so-impactful PT demo from 2014. The game has been in early access for over 2 years now, and has just received its full release on October 30th, 2020. The early access version of the game sported 2 lengthy chapters full of terrifying content that people were enthralled by, including myself. The full release added 2 more chapters to the game, creating a grand total of 4. Without spoiling anything, I'm just gonna say this right off the bat. Visage is the most terrifying game I have ever played, and I have a vast collection in my horror catalog. While Visage has earned this badge of honor from me, that doesn't mean it's the best horror game I've ever played, not by a long shot, particularly its fully released version. Welcome to the lab, and I'm going to start off with a non-spoiler segment, then move on to the real meat of what I truly think about this game. Let's get started. Visage is essentially every horror cliché you've ever seen smashed into one game. We've got haunted houses, dark tunnels, abandoned hospitals, VHS tapes, creepy little girls, creepy old ladies, laboratories, factories, dark dream sequences, you name it, Visage has it. What really makes it stand out though is that Visage pulls off most of these clichés really well. Its atmosphere is phenomenal. The main house makes you feel unsafe at all times. Even when you know the layout of the house back and forth, you'll still be scared to wander the corridors, no matter how late into the game you are. Floorboards creak, light switches get flicked on and off, you think you hear footsteps so you stop moving, only for those sounds to stop too. The first 2 hours of this game, in my opinion, are worth the price alone, just for the unforgettable experience. It is scarier than PT, it is scarier than Resident Evil 7, it is scarier than Outlast. Do yourself a favor and play this in a dark room alone late at night. I can't quite describe exactly how it gets this simple concept so right, when there's so many other indie games that try and do the same, but damn, it does get it right. If that description sounded good to you, and that's all I can really say to keep this segment spoiler-free, then just buy the game. It's best experienced without knowing anything prior, and just as a warning, this is another game that doesn't hold your hand. You're usually given one clue on how to progress, and if that clue seems vague to you, you'd better start getting creative. I strongly encourage you not to look at any guides until you get to the last chapter. You'll know what I'm talking about. Before that, for chapters 1 through 3, give yourself a solid 20 minutes to figure out a puzzle or how to progress, and I swear it feels rewarding figuring it all out on your own. If you're more skeptical about your horror games, stick around right now. Here are some negative aspects of Visage. The inventory system is clunky and somewhat difficult to get used to. There's never an indication that you can click inside your inventory to store your currently held consumable item. I figured that out on my own by accident. The system is also incredibly limited. You can hold only 4 consumables, and there's many times in the game where your hands have to be occupied by a key item. Limited inventories aren't a bad thing, but you're constantly in need of these consumables, so you're going to be dropping them and picking them back up a lot. I'm pushing the boundaries of what spoiling is in order to convey this negative aspect, but I'm gonna say this game's style plays out just like Resident Evil 7 in terms of progression. It starts out swinging, hitting you hard with heart attacks, but somewhere after the halfway mark, the quality drops significantly. You know how Resi 7 just throws the molded at you for the last few chapters? This game does something similar with a different type of enemy. And the last negative aspect is the other side of the coin, and the good thing I mentioned earlier. Sometimes the game takes it too far with the whole not telling you anything idea. You will find yourself wandering aimlessly, opening every cabinet and dresser you see, desperately trying to find some way to progress the story. If you've got a keen eye or tend to get lucky, I'd say still go for it blind. But if you're getting frustrated, like I said, give it 20 minutes, and then go ahead and look at a guide. As for a quick frame of reference, I did not use a guide in order to beat this game, not once. The main reason for that is I was playing it so soon after its release that nobody had created a guide for it yet, so I was playing in the dark. My playtime without a guide was a little over 11 hours. I think it could have easily been 7 if I had a guide, I'm not kidding. And that's it on the overarching opinion. I need to talk about the story now, the goods and bads of it, so here comes the spoiler review. The game begins with a gruesome scene. The character you play as is in the process of murdering his family in cold blood, concluding with finishing himself off. You then wake up and begin walking around the house with striking similarities to PT. You learn about items and sanity, along with the beginning of paranormal events. You'll eventually come across an item that states it will begin a chapter. These chapters are what make up the progression of the game, and they explore the lives of the people who lived in the house before you. So as you walk around the house, think of it as sort of a hub for it to begin the actual story elements of the game, which take you to other places. The chapter layouts are the same except for the final one. You begin in the house, then you solve a light puzzle, followed by being transported to a different location and reliving the events of the dead person's life. This is where the caves, hospital, and other locations come into play. The chapters revolve around the characters Lucy, Dolores, Rakan, and you, the player character Dwayne. In my opinion, the chapters descend in quality as they ascend in order. Lucy's chapter is by far the most frightening, and Dwayne's chapter is the least frightening and the most tedious. I think it may be worth pointing out that Rakan's and Dwayne's chapters were added in order to complete the game. Lucy and Dolores' chapters have been in the game for a long time. I personally find the content available in the early access version of the game more enthralling and scarier than in the content added in full release. Now, I'm not going to make any statements like, oh, the devs got lazy with their early access money, but factually, scenarios, scenes, and many assets are reused in the Chapter 4 sequences of the game, along with only one enemy type, so it really just feels like it was kind of thrown together. So just take that as you will. But let's talk about the good stuff. Chapters 1 and 2 are great horror content, filled with threatening enemies and interesting puzzles. Lucy and her monster are extremely imposing, and Lucy's introduction was, in my opinion, better than in the PT demo. The first encounter with her was so chilling, I didn't know whether I would die in the game or have a heart attack in real life first. Camera mechanic is a great way of showing how this game pulls off its cliches really well. It gets a bit annoying having to use the camera so often in the dark, but when it goes for a scare, it really works. I also like how if you're quick enough with the camera, you can stop the shadow monster from pursuing you. It's a bit difficult to pull off, though. Dolores isn't as threatening of a pursuer, she's just kind of an old lady. Her chapter is full of mesmerizing environments, though, and there's still the threat of death to you at almost all times. The game takes a turn when you get to Rakan's chapter. It shifts from mind-bending but doable puzzles over to the pure chase sequences. I think it's somewhat appropriate since it reflects Rakan's personality of being more aggressive, but once again, he's just not as threatening. He literally comes at you with 2 broken legs. They made this chapter in the hospital setting, so I think Rakan's design could have been a little more creative, sort of like Lucy's missing jaw. You do, however, get introduced to these lovely creatures, the apparitions that Rakan has been seeing that have made him go insane. They're actually pretty unsettling, and it's made better that they aren't over the top with their design. After you get through these chase sequences in the hospital setting, you complete Rakan's chapter and begin the ever-so-elusive 4th and final chapter. Before I talk about that, though, I'd just like to quickly point out that not only the house binds these 3 chapters and characters together, but there seems to be a hidden storyline happening in the background. The characters seem to experience intense schizophrenia-related symptoms, seemingly due to the house, and they all end up receiving some form of treatment. The game goes out of its way to point out that whenever one of these characters receives treatment, their condition worsens. In Rakan's case, he was experiencing paranoia and hallucinations, and there's actually some clues to indicate that he might have been onto something rather than just being crazy, which is further emphasized by his method of death. I could be reading too much into it, but to me it seems like outside forces are perpetuating or causing the residents of the house to go crazy, maybe experimenting on them even.
I don't want their help anymore. She's only been worsening ever since we went to these doctors. Imaginary friends and all these weird behaviors. She doesn't even call me Mom anymore!
That suspicion made the storyline more interesting to me, but then Chapter 4 happens. Chapter 4 contains everything that's wrong with the game, maximized tenfold. It is the only chapter that begins without visually notifying you that it has began, leading to a lot of confusion and people asking on the discussion boards about how to begin the chapter. This is a problem since the developers specifically stated that they added a 3rd and 4th chapter, What they should have said was that they added a third chapter in either an epilogue or finale event, because technically, you're building up the materials you need to complete Chapter 4 the entire time you're playing the game. The main objective of the chapter is to find obscure locations in the house that initiate a memory sequence about the player character, Dwayne. Every time you complete a memory sequence, you get a piece of a mirror mask. Collect all 7 pieces of the mask, and you complete the game. There's a couple of problems with this. First is how difficult it is to find these memory sequence locations in the house. There's these creepy VHS tapes that usually give you about a 3-second view of where to look in the house to begin a memory sequence, but they aren't always too clear. And let me just say, I really like the VHS tapes. They're unsettling as hell, and I like the idea of you having to watch closely to look for clues. The major problem is that these VHS tapes are hidden too. Besides the few that are given to you from the previous 3 chapters, the majority of my time spent in Visage overall was searching for the other VHS tapes. The environments are just so detailed, and there's so much clutter everywhere that there's just too many places to look. Good from a design perspective, the house looks really realistic, but terrible in terms of searching for one specific object that you aren't given any hints on. Let's say you've got a keener eye than me though, or you've looked at a guide. I believe this entire chapter, the longest chapter, to have the weakest story and scare elements in the entire game. The only actual enemy that can harm you are these lame ink creatures who didn't seem threatening to me at all. The game also reuses eyeless enemies from Rakan's chapter, and they lose their initial creepiness since you get used to looking at them so much. The story aspect is also collected in pieces with each memory, and I have to say it's the most boring and uneventful story out of all of them. Having the story in pieces implies that there's a mystery element to the story, but you don't even have to play any of this chapter in order to figure out Dwayne's story. Just the opening cutscene and looking around the house will tell you enough. Beer cans everywhere and an empty house tells you more than enough information, but every memory sequence just drills into your head that Dwayne drinks too much. The only mystery element about it is one cutscene where Dwayne's wife is scolding him for taking drugs too. She's upset, but also confused about where he got them from.
Dwayne, I want to help you. First the alcohol and now this? Who prescribed you this and why? I want to know so I can help you through it. Are you slowly going insane, Dwayne? Should we be worried? Because we are.
She also mentions another time that Dwayne was a nice guy before and used to care about all of them. To me, that says maybe these pills are from that outside source I mentioned earlier. Maybe someone else is responsible for Dwayne's descent into insanity and eventually his murderous actions. But other than that one interesting mention, enjoy 7 chapters worth of Dwayne just drinking a lot. Like, wow, drugs and alcohol cause tensions and conflict with families. Who knew that? They kind of put themselves into a bad spot here. Since the other chapters were so interesting, they made it hard to compete with themselves in the storytelling department. Okay, rant over. Those are honestly the only negatives I can think about in this game. I'm going to point out a couple more things that make this game really stand out for me before I wrap this up. Visage not only masters the direct visualizations of horror, but I think it does an even better job at putting you through discrete horror, which I believe to be way more impactful than just shoving a monster in your face. I have 3 examples of this discrete horror that I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. The first example of this is during the beginning of Lucy's chapter. You explore around her room and eventually arrive in her closet, where you come across this drawing. Seeing this drawing made me freeze in my tracks, since you know exactly what the game wants you to do. This makes your blood run cold. First of all, now there's something on the other side of the wall that wasn't there before. What is it? Why is it there? The power of the unknown is the most effective way to instill fear into anyone. Your only basis for what just knocked on your wall is this child's drawing, and it leaves a lot to the imagination. The only thing you know for sure is that it's probably big. You get the answer to what this creature looks like later, but the actual encounters don't hold a candle to this first introduction. The second example is Lucy herself, where the game uses a classic but clever trick in order to scare you into beginning to anticipate her physical arrival. So, The television turns on and you see this video. You're startled at first because your initial reaction is that she may be behind you, but upon closer inspection you'll see that it's a different television and a different record player in the screen. At this point in the game, you haven't found this room yet, so when nothing happens you shrug it off and move on. Later, when you make your way down to the basement, you see this and freeze in your tracks. You can hear breathing, and the room is designed so you don't have the same angle of vision that the TV was showing. So you know that Lucy is standing right there, but you can't see her from where you're standing. This puts you in an uncomfortable position since you're forced to confront her in order to progress. The final example I have is the neighbor. I thought the neighbor was a really cool Easter egg in the game that contributed to its atmosphere. As soon as the game begins, she calls you from next door, saying she hasn't heard from you in a while.
Hello, Dwayne. It's Rose, your neighbor. I know it's late, and I know that I tend to be a little anxious about small things. I apologize for that, but I'm getting a bit worried. I haven't seen you out of the house in about 3 weeks. Is everything all right? Could you call me just to let me know everything's fine? All right. Bye-bye.
She sounds genuine, but the phone call doesn't cause anything else, so once again, you shrug it off. Throughout the game, there are these optional comic book pages you can collect for a comic called The Neighbors. As you collect them and put them together, it reveals that the next door neighbors have been living there for a long time, and witnessing the downfall of all the previous residents of the haunted house you play the game in. There's a page for each chapter of the game, and they usually end each part with the neighbor's husband doing something abusive towards her. When you find the last page, you discover something dark. The last page depicts the neighbor having the same conversation that she had with you in the beginning of the game, except it shows what she was doing during that call, drinking the blood of her recently murdered husband. This makes the conversation from earlier a lot more chilling, and after you complete the comic, you get another phone call.
She'll take your body, and then she'll take your mind. Dwayne. Oh, Dwayne. The years just pile on, don't they? Time is a funny little bitch. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Time just keeps on taking. But me, I've wasted enough time in this house. It's time I get out there and live. Speaking of, what all are you up to? Maybe I'll stop by later. Frank's a little busy, and I could use the company.
And those were some of the highlights about the more subtle horror that I loved in this game, which leads me to the conclusion of my review analysis. Do I recommend this game? If you're a horror fan, absolutely. It manages to separate itself from other indie titles, and it absolutely captures the spirit of PT while still being its own unique creation. I'm gonna give this game a 3 out of 5. Thanks for watching.